This is an exciting time when we can start thinking about the future of our trees. And with that said, there's a lot of challenges. Our infrastructure, our bridges, our roads, our cityscapes, and our trees are aging, and many of them are in their 11th hour, and we need to act now, and we need to act together across professions. So today is an opportunity to start that conversation. There's so many benefits of trees. I'm going to crunch fold it into just a couple minutes, and I do have references and resources at the end of my presentation for all things arboriculture, and also I have references coming up very soon to two particular research papers on the topic of benefits of trees. So I hope that you'll feel free to dig in deeper on this really important topic. We have something called urban heat islands. I'm sure that you're familiar with those, particularly in hot urban parking lots. We've got temperatures that can be 20 or 25 degrees higher than the ambient temperature in a park-like setting, such as this tree is depicted in. So the fact that we have these trees that can cool significantly urban heat islands is a huge advantage to making sure that, that we're replacing and renewing trees in our older and our newer parking lots, particularly those with dark asphalt. Trees, of course, provide shade. They can reduce internal energy use and costs by 30 to 50%, which is really substantial. They also clean the air. They remove dust, they absorb pollutants, and of course, in the process of photosynthesis, they release oxygen. Carbon dioxide, as you know, is a contributor to climate change, and trees can help by absorbing carbon dioxide and storing it in their wood. Trees also provide windbreaks. They capture runoff and stormwater flooding. We already know that they beautify neighborhoods. They can even increase property values pretty significantly. And there's been quite a bit of research about the impact of trees on reducing crime. A really fascinating area is in biophilia, or it's the impact of life on life, why life needs other life. And trees and other living things have been found to improve mental and emotional health. They reduce glare and reflection. They can be a sound barrier. And of course, they provide habitat for animals and microorganisms. Here's some pictures of urban heat islands. The top two show the difference that's made by trees providing shade. The bottom picture shows a parking lot void of trees. Very dismal looking, very hot. Asphalt, of course, re-radiates heat. So a tree that's in a more park-like setting actually, as it cools the air, can reduce temperature somewhat, but not nearly as much as the impact of those trees in a particular parking lot with a lot of asphalt. One of the goals in our University of California projects, and a goal that we're working with IERCD on, is to make sure that we're enhancing tree canopies in underserved neighborhoods. This picture is a neighborhood that's adjacent to our former cooperative extension office in San Bernardino. You can see the large area of the dark blue. That denotes a canopy cover of far less than the preferred 23 to 25%. It's actually well below 11% on average. And with that, in these underserved neighborhoods, there does tend to be a higher percentile of poverty, of health issues such as cardiovascular disease and asthma, and also high levels of ozone pollution. Now, I'm not saying this is direct cause and effect, but there's a strong association. And in many of our projects, including the North Redlands one, we're working with other organizations like RCD and with the City of Redlands, University of Redlands, ESRI, to make sure that over the next 50, hopefully 80 years, that the trees in these neighborhoods will enhance the canopy to that desired 23-25%, where it's most needed. There's a beautiful neighborhood in the city of Atherton, very park-fed, very dense foliage, a very, very high tree canopy. So when you compare that to the previous tree canopy, you can see that there's quite a difference in what a neighborhood has as far as the ability of trees to provide all those benefits. In a city like Atherton, and in particular in this neighborhood, you can see that the percentile of poverty, of asthma, cardiovascular diseases, and ozone pollution is significantly lower than in the underserved neighborhood of San Bernardino. Here's a couple recommended references on benefits of trees. I will make my talk available to anybody that wants it. So all those that you registered for the conference, I will send you a link to where these and other resources and talks will be housed. I want to switch gears and talk about proper tree selection and care. I will tell you that the picture in the upper right, beautiful tree, but it's also become invasive. And in some cases, they're doing even better than some of our natives who just can't bear the higher heat and lack of water under adverse conditions. But that's the blue gum eucalyptus. So it certainly served its purpose over the last several decades, but we want to engage with tree species that are underrepresented, that native and otherwise are well adapted to our hotter, drier, and weirder climates. I'm going to be talking about the trees from a study that a couple of you mentioned, including Rose. We have a project with United States Forest Service, Greg McPherson and Natalie Dorn and team, and we're working on getting the assessment of trees that currently represent 1% or less of those trees found in our normal streetscapes as an add-on to enhance the diversity and also the canopies of our neighborhoods. The reason it's so important that we're having this conversation about trees for tomorrow start today is the vast majority of plant disorders are actually due to non-living conditions, and they're completely preventable. After my presentation, we're going to have a couple more talks that touch on this topic of, are your trees safe, and what are tree risk assessment capabilities that you can, through software programs and through working with certified arborists, can employ in your own cities. We want to avoid these situations from the get-go because every tree that's either improperly selected due to climate or not properly cared for is taking precious time, taking precious years away from the opportunity to have the recommended species in the right location cared for correctly. And that significantly plummets opportunities for enhancing the benefits of trees in our urban areas. One place that's a great starting point is to make sure that trees are selected based on your climate zone. And we strongly prefer that you use the sunset Western climate zones rather than the USDA. The sunset zones are smaller, they're more precise, and they're based not only on last frost date and colder temperatures, but more so on how do these trees do under heat and under higher temperatures. USDA zones are great for farmers in the Midwest, but again, the whole point of them was to help predict the acceptable planting date based on what the expected last frost date was. There's only 13 of these USDA zones, as you can see here, whereas we have more than 30 climate zones that are listed under the Sunset Western Garden Zone categories. You can see here the Northern California and the Southern California sunset climate zones. There's 20 of them represented in these pictures. And then we have several more in the greater Los Angeles area. So the sunset zones have the advantage because they're also more precise. There's many more of them. They're smaller. And as you can see, when you're looking at climate zone 20 versus 22, which is closer to the coast and a less extreme climate, that the smaller zones, the smaller climates that are so important to the success of our trees and agronomy, our crops, are accounted for if we select based on the sunset climate zones rather than the USDA zones. When we're talking about tree selection, then my favorite topic is the Climate Ready Landscape Tree Project. It started about 4.5 years ago. It's in cooperation, as I mentioned, with the United States Forest Service, with Natalie, Greg, and Erica, myself and Allison, Jim Downer, and Darren Haver are in charge of the trees in Southern and Northern California. I'm going to share some information about why they were selected and the goals of the project. We talked about this about 6 years ago among our group of United States Forest Service and UC A&R scientists. And we wanted to plant some trees that were underrepresented. We selected them using the CalAdept model to make sure that they would be friendly, whether we have more tumultuous conditions, whether we have few, if any, rainfall, and also the encountered high heat and flooding. We vetted 100 trees. We took into account their habitat, their physiology, and their biological interactions. So we looked at soil moisture needs, we looked at wind tolerance, and all those other factors. So we started out with a list of over 100, and the second step was to consult with other experts, to compile tree inventories, and to cross-reference the trees to see what the underrepresented species were most likely to be. The selected finalists are native around the world, many to, if not California, to the Southwest. Also, we have some Australian trees. This is our UC Riverside plot about 6 months ago. The trees are doing great. They were planted in the fall of 2016, so they're going into their 5th year. They're all fast growers. They grow 2 to 3 feet a year. They require very low maintenance, and we've had the water turned off since last March. So this is a picture of them going into a real era of drought. I wanted to share some of the data from some of the strongest performers to date and talk a little bit about what this means to you, whether you're a city official, whether you're an arborist, whether you're on your HOA board, any other green industry leader, master gardener, or just a concerned citizen interested in right tree, right place, right care. Island oak is doing really, really well in the Riverside plots. It is a California native. You can see it's very adapted to many, many sunset zones throughout California. I like it because it's an evergreen. It grows almost as wide as it grows tall, and it's also adaptive to a wide soil range. I'll be mentioning a few search indices in which you can select up to 6 or 8 criteria for, again, finding that near perfect tree. There's no perfect tree, but there's some that come plenty close enough. So if you go into the selecttree.calpoly.edu, you can search by city or you can search by tree species to make sure that the tree that you're interested in will do well in your climate zone, and also what we narrowly define as your microclimate. What other conditions around your house do these trees need to be able to adapt to? Do you have construction nearby? Do you have enough space? Rosewood, magnolia, these oak trees, they need to be at least 15 feet away from any structure. So you can see these, we call them fact sheets in the search engine, that if you look on the right, any pest and disease information that's known will be listed. So again, there's no perfect species. You can see that while this particular oak is resistant to verticillium, which is a fungal root rot, it is susceptible to armillaria. Armillaria in our cities is much more rare than verticillium. And fortunately, this tree isn't susceptible to the shot-hole borer and Phytophthora and some more adverse conditions. Another tree doing really well is the Celtis reticulata, the net leaf hackberry. Some of the names don't sound very attractive. Like hackberry doesn't sound like a tree that you might recommend to your HOA, but believe me, it's performing really, really well beyond our expectations. It's deciduous. It grows to be about 35 by 30 feet. It's very habitat friendly. It has the fruits, but inconspicuous flowers. Again, if you enter it into the Urban Forest Ecosystems Institute / Cal Poly searchable index, you'll find notes, you'll find its characteristics, you'll find what zones it does well in, and any kind of pest and disease information. Another one of my favorites, is the Maverick mesquite. The Maverick mesquite is a tree that grows really fast. It's native to the Southwest United States. It's thornless. It's drought, heat, and cold tolerant. It grows, again, about as broad as tall. This one has got to be one of my top 2 favorites, the pistachia red push. When you look at the foliage, you think of Maine, or in my case, Minnesota, where I went to college and grad school in the fall, because it has kind of that sugar maple kind of red, brilliant tinge. But this is actually in the spring when it first leaves out. So this isn't fall color. This is actually the color of the original foliage that pops, especially when you have the green foliage and evergreens behind this tree. It's performing really well. Here's pictures of it when it was quite young. The left picture is at our UC Riverside plot. The right picture is, Liz mentioned it, we've got a plot of 4 of these species that are at Chino Basin Water Conservation District. And we have a plot there adjacent to an urban heat island. You can see the asphalt on that street that's behind the reservoir. So these are providing not only a visual screen, but also a windbreak. These trees are all off water. The trees at Chino Basin have mulch or no mulch. So that's a sister project to the larger project at UC Riverside. This is another one where I wouldn't have named it Bubba, but somebody did, and kudos to Bubba. It might be my favorite tree right now as far as the study goes. Again, it grows fast, it's fantastic, beautiful trumpet-like flowers, very low maintenance, drought and heat tolerant. It also takes a fairly high pH, which we're going to talk about in the care section a little later. The Desert Museum Palo Verde is thornless. It's a 3-way cross. The other 3 species are also nice, but this one has the best and the most attributes of those 3 all wrapped into one tree. This is it going into its 4th year at UC Riverside. The only downside to this is that it is susceptible to the shot-hole borer. So we're hesitating to actually recommend it, because one of the things that wearing our other research hats and working with some of you is to make sure that we're not planting trees that are either invasive or susceptible to the shot-hole borer. We did present a paper. This was actually virtual. It was last August. The American Society for Horticulture Science meeting was to be live in Orlando. Obviously, that didn't happen. So I presented this as a poster and also a oral presentation. And this has to do with the 4 trees that are planted at Chino Basin Water Conservation District that are in our study, the same 4 from the larger study that we wanted to sort of spawn in this other study looking at either mulch or no mulch. And what's interesting is, to date, the results show that 3 of those 4 species grow faster and perform better under organic mulch. But one of them, and that's the Parkinsonia Desert Museum that I just showed you, that actually performs and grows faster and better with no organic mulch at all. So in an area that's not prone so much to shot hole borer and is perhaps in a fire zone where you don't want any organic materials in mulch, then perhaps this is a great specimen tree under those conditions. We also have the same 12 species planted in Irvine at South Coast Research and Extension Center, and my colleague Darren Haver oversees that project. But there's also 2 other species that were selected more because of their coastal adaptation, and that's the Brazilian cedarwood and the Catalina cherry. So we've got updates on how they're doing as well. We also have a bevy of these trees that are in the Central Valley up in the Sacramento area, and some of the same species that you heard me just discuss that are planted at UC Riverside are also represented in this Northern California trial. Some of them are a little bit different. So here's some data through 2017 on height and the percent of death from transplanting, et cetera. So I wanted to circle back to sharing just 3 really reputable search engines to help you identify trees that are adapted to your climate and your microclimate, which are the specific conditions around that tree that it will need to perform well under. Here's a picture that shows some examples of obviously avoiding tall trees under utility lines. We don't want to top trees. We want to think ahead and make sure that we're not planting a tree that's that in its native conditions is going to need 35, 50, 60 feet of height to perform well, because we don't want to come back and realize our mistake and top the tree and try to right a wrong that way, because you just end up with 2 wrongs. So I'm going to go through these very, very quickly, just with some examples. So the first database I already shared with you, that's the Urban Forest Ecosystem Institute / Cal Poly SLO searchable database. The other one is the California Native Plant Society searchable plant selection website. And then WUCLS, which is our University of California water use classification of landscape species website. So here's the select tree. Again, you can search by name. You have a choice of all these characteristics. I'm going to show you from some screenshots that I just took last night. So you can click climate zone, pest and disease information, any kind of health, safety, and environmental concerns. So I did a sample for you where I selected maximum height, 35 feet or less, sunset climate zone 19, which is the inland basin of Los Angeles County into the San Bernardino and Riverside valleys. And voila, 160 trees were found. And then you can click on the pictures and thumbnails and get those fact sheets. Here's the WUCLs, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. You can select by city. I clicked, for an example, very low and low water use tree, and 249 examples will pop up that you need to click and check out as far as diseases, insects, their invasive nature, and whether they're going to perform well under your microclimate. The California Native Plant Society, CalScape, is another really great website. I just clicked on California, and you'll see that there's nearly 8,000 plants, not all trees. There's also some herbaceous plants and some smaller shrubs that are recommended across the state. So I selected a tree, extremely low or very low or low water use. And that was it, and 81 plants on that CalScape are recommended. And then again, you can click on those thumbnails and get more than enough information. So the last 10 or 15 minutes, I just want to kind of do a 80 mile an hour. Here's what to do when you're selecting and caring for your trees to avoid problems in the future and to maximize their impact environmentally. First of all, when you select trees at the nursery, you want to make sure that the root system isn't wrapped and girdled. The picture you see here is almost a perfect root system where it's about half roots to soil. You don't see kinked, girdled, and circled roots, and that plant can stand up on its own when it's out of the pot. So remember that what goes on underground, just because you can't see it, is really, really important for what happens in the long run as far as the success of that tree. You want to make the planting hole at least 2.5 times wider than the container. You want to plant at the same depth as the tree was in its container. You don't want to plant the stem underground and end up with rots that otherwise would have been either confined to the root system or perhaps avoided altogether. This is back at Chino Basin Water Conservation District. This is Frankie, who now works for City of Chino, I believe. This is the high quality mulch that we were using for our tree study over there. So mulch is fantastic around trees. It can reduce water evaporation from the soil, weeds, buffer soil temperature, and it also prevents weed whip and lawnmower damage. You want to spread it out toward the drip line. You don't want it touching the tree. You want to avoid what we call affectionately mulch volcanoes. Again, you don't want to have a condition where either the water isn't getting through the mulch into the soil when you're irrigating the trees, or worse yet, the water is actually in a stagnant condition and it's adjacent to that trunk and resulting in rots. Never top a tree. It's not the right way to care for a tree. This was in my own HOA, and I was actually presenting a webinar, and I heard the chainsaws. I heard them starting, and went out after lunch and saw this happening. So the red X just shows no, we don't top trees. That's not recommended. The pictures on the left, on the top, show a tree before it was pruned, and on the bottom, after it was pruned correctly. You don't want to flush cut. You want to cut outside what's called the branch collar. Otherwise, you're cutting right into the trunk. This is a really, really complicated topic. I suggest that any maturing trees that you make sure that you get a certified arborist on your team to take care of your trees. This isn't something that's easily learned from a website or a book. So part of what we want to push out today is getting at the front end a certified arborist on your project team, rather than when it's too late and something like a tree out of place is causing problems and needs to be dealt with. You can see on the top how the callus tissue is developing in a circular fashion around a properly removed limb versus on the bottom where those limbs, the branches were flush cut off of the main trunk. These are just examples that unfortunately are far too common. This is a tree out of place, and by definition, it's a weed. So this is something that you can't fix after the fact. These are hazardous trees. You certainly want to avoid liability in your cities. And the way to do that is right tree, right place, right care. Mulches can also help avoid damage from lawnmowers and weed whips. We published a paper a couple years ago about the actual water savings potential in professionally managed landscapes. So there's my colleagues, Darren Haver, Carrie Reed, and Lauren Oakey, Dave Frugino next to me with the poster presentation at a UCR field day, and one of our study sites for a project that involved ways to see if best practices could reduce water loss by 30 to 50% across the state at these 32 sites. So what we found were just implementing what we call best management practices, which means that when it comes to irrigation, making sure that the system is properly maintained, that it has the right pressure, that the heads are spaced correctly, and that you're irrigating the plants according to their needed water, time-wise and frequency-wise. And we found out that implementing these best practices not only improve plant health, but it saves between 1.3 million to almost 3 million acre feet of water annually. So it's not just plopping a native drought-efficient plant into the middle of a landscape. It's making sure that it's irrigated appropriately to save the most water and to ensure the health of the plants. Any of you that are interested in digging in really deeply to our UC work might find one or both of these papers useful. One is the water requirements of landscape plant studies conducted by University of California. That covers a 30-year history from the implementation of the California Irrigation Management Information System, CIMAS, to some of the drones and things that Dr. Amir Hegverdi is doing with precision ag when it comes to irrigating landscapes efficiently. And then we wrote a public policy paper, which is depicted on the right, about UCANR research and education influencing landscape water conservation and public policy. Irrigation, it's a huge issue. Up to 90% of the problems that we identify with the specimens that arborists and golf course superintendents and other green industry and city people bring to us to run samples on tend to circle back to a root, soil, and irrigation problem. You can see on the right where the sprinkler system is watering turf and hitting the tree trunk, not good for the tree, deflecting water from the turf. The bottom picture is a tree that failed right across the street from my house. So trees that are maturing prefer to be watered much, much less often, but much deeper for much longer periods of time than the turf. We also find, if you look at the upper left, the curves there, that obviously in Palm Springs, we do need to maintain our trees at about 35% more water than we apply in Riverside or San Bernardino. And those of you fortunate to live more along the coast have a more buffered temperature, and the evapotranspiration rate, therefore, is much lower. So remember that about 85% of the water that's needed to keep our trees healthy occurs in the summer months. Here's a couple pictures of some really good examples. You can see that the trees have mulch around them. The turf is not growing closer to the trunk than several feet, and they're also irrigated on separate systems. Most trees, if grown correctly in the nursery and allowed to develop strength at the base of their main trunk, don't ever need to be staked. Here's some examples of staking that is recommended if you're in a particularly wind-prone area, or if that tree needs to be weaned off the stakes that it was held to, very harshly in its nursery container. So over time, though, you want to loosen the guys. You want to make sure that the tree can gently flex in the wind. So you don't want it like a soldier that can't move, or a sardine in a can that's too crowded. You want to make sure that there's flex. Over time, you can have a lot of damage to the cambium, which impacts the water and the conductance of food in both the xylem and phloem. The cambium is the actual growth tissue. It's right outside of the phloem, xylem, and right inside the bark. So we don't want to girdle trees. We want to avoid hardware overkill. Grates are great because it keeps compaction off of the tree root system, but they need to be expanded as trees mature. We recommend making sure that wherever you're thinking about planting a tree, that the drainage is adequate. So we suggest making a hole at least the size of the pot. Now, when you plant that tree, again, you want it to be 2.5 or even wider than that, the size of the pot. But for the drainage test, you can make it the size, in this case, of a 15-gallon container. If this hasn't drained by certainly 24 hours, then it's a horrible place to put a tree. We also don't recommend adding any soil amendments, because you can end up with circled and girdled roots, rather than the roots moving out from that perfect compost or other kind of soil amendment that you added. Since we're not producing a crop, then we can cut way back on what we used to recommend as far as the fertilizer rate. Some of our older publications still suggest that annually that we apply up to a 1/2 pound of nitrogen per circumference inch of tree trunk. We've halved that. That recommendation is now 1/4 or less nitrogen. And in many cases, only if you see symptoms, such as on this tree. We're not producing a crop, so we don't have a case in point where during a fill period for an avocado or a citrus, you need to adjust your irrigation and fertilizer. We're growing ornamentals, so it's more of an even growth throughout the year without this fill period, which is a huge advantage, and which over time greatly reduces the need for regular fertilization. We have soils in California that tend to be alkaline. So remember that our micronutrients, manganese, iron, and zinc can be tied up. Here's some symptoms of what we call interveinal chlorosis, where the veins remain green, but the rest of the leaf is yellow. And that's most often a zinc, manganese, sometimes an iron deficiency. The top right is a nitrogen deficiency, where you can see that the older leaves are turning yellow and chlorotic, but the newer leaves are green because nitrogen's really mobile. So it moves with the water and it's going to green up the newer foliage. So it's good just to have an idea of what nutrients are needed and what nutrient deficiencies look like. Here's some resources. One of the websites that's really important is the International Society of Arboriculture. And as Rose indicated, The Western Chapter ISA is really active, lots of educational events for certified arborists. That's their website. Then the ISA also has a consumer kind of fronted website called Trees Are Good. And there's all kinds of fact sheets, of care guides, ability of you to check out the credentials of an arborist, find out if indeed that person is certified, and all things trees are on that website. And then we have several publications through University of California Ag and Natural Resources. That's our catalog. We also have pest management guidelines, lots of them. I'll be posting this and you'll receive a link as well as this presentation after the workshop's over. And then I have monthly blogs that tend to pertain to abiotic disorders, since most of the disorders that we see in our trees are not actually due to true diseases or insect damage. They may be later a cause of concern, but the original cause is almost always some kind of issue with irrigation, soil drainage, or abiotic kinds of issues. So here's some links to my blogs, and I hope again that that you'll take a look at some of these references. So I know this has been a lot of material in a very short period of time, but I wanted to thank you for sharing later today your reaction to some of the things that that I've discussed. And if any of this rings true, then please, during your roundtable, share your thoughts about it. And also, if you disagree with the information that's being presented, then please, this is a discussion, and we want to hear alternative viewpoints. We want to keep our trees healthy, and we always advocate research-based information, which is what we're here today to share with you. So we're going to hold the questions until later in the morning. We have 15 minutes between noon and 12:15 when we'll be able to address any questions or concerns that you might have. So thank you so much.